Leadership is sort of the topic du jour these days and has been for quite some time. All of us who are in ministry know all the books that have been written about ministry leadership, but it's not just us. Everybody knows John Maxwell and other writers on leadership. And I mean, if you go into any bookstore, you can find a book on leadership using almost any analogy you can think of. But in spite of this wealth of information, and sometimes maybe because of it, it is easy for congregations, denominations, parachurch organizations, and even leaders themselves to lose sight of what is really important. Now, Paul, Silas, and Timothy have their own purpose for engaging this issue in this letter. They want to remind the Thessalonians that they can have confidence in the gospel that they have received precisely because they know the kind of people who presented that gospel to them. But in so doing, these three missionaries give us a model that we can emulate as we think about what it means to be a Christian leader, how Christian leadership ought to be practiced, and how it ought to be evaluated. So let's begin this morning by kind of thinking about where are we? Where are we as a society on this question of leadership? And more specifically, where are we as North American Christians on leadership? Now, of course, this conversation has broader implications than just North America, because what we tend to do in our attempts to do ministry tends to find its way into churches all around the world. But let's just focus on us, okay? And as we think about what North American Christians value in leadership, we're not thinking about what they say they value, okay? We're thinking about what they actually value. Of course, there's been some research done on that, but I'm also drawing on my own experience. Experience as a pastor, as a seminary professor, as a long time ago, a personnel committee chairman. As an associate pastor, I have kind of done the gamut here. And one of the things that people very often value is what is sometimes called charisma. Now, as just about any business leadership book will tell you, charisma is very hard to define, very difficult to quantify. Sometimes we just call it the it factor. But very often when we think about charisma, we're thinking about someone's ability to draw a crowd, to bring people in, and to hold their attention and very often their loyalty whenever they are in front of the room, right? And believe me, charisma is a valuable thing to have. Some people have it, some people don't, some people have some of it, or only some of it in certain situations, or whatever. It's a great thing to have if you can have it. But here's the thing, charisma in that sort of sense is not the same thing as spiritual giftedness. Now, sometimes a person's spiritual giftedness will manifest itself in terms of that kind of charisma, but charisma is not the same thing as spiritual giftedness. Another thing that people often on search committees and such look for is vision. Now, I got to tell you, when I have talked to a committee or whatever, I don't like those kinds of, well, what is your vision for our church questions? I don't even know your church yet. You know, vision is something that for most of us comes over long periods of exposure. You know, I taught for B.H. Carroll for 10 or 11 years. I've got some vision there, you know, things I want to see Carroll become, right? Some church in, you know, rural Wisconsin, maybe not. But again, here's the other problem. Just because someone has a vision does not mean that it comes from God. Right? Okay? Then, of course, there is success. Now, as you know, as Americans, we like to say, and with some justification, past results are the best indicator of future outcomes, right? And maybe there's some truth to that. But anybody who's ever been in ministry knows that there is so much going into whatever ministry success is. And then you've got the problem of how do you define success? We'll come back to that at the end of this conversation. Now, likewise, there are things that we also ignore sometimes. Sometimes we ignore the importance of emotional sensitivity and intelligence. You know, a lot of being a pastor is dealing with people. It's you know, it's the nuts and bolts stuff of marrying and burying and, you know. And in fact, disciple making is really about dealing with people. And as we've talked about in this church many times, people are not simply walking brains. They have hearts. And those hearts have to be connected with and ministered to. You know, think about it this way. This is a little bit of a different way to think about it, but I find it helpful. Communication specialists tell us that 55% of what you communicate to people around you is nonverbal, completely nonverbal. It's all the physical stuff, you know. And then another 38% of it is your tone of voice. Only 7% of what you communicate is the actual words that you use. That says something about who we are as people, doesn't it? We are not simply logic centers with legs. We are not at all like Mr. Spock or Commander Data. You know, we're not. That's not who we are. So emotional sensitivity is important. Theological depth is important. And, you know, it's all, you know, fun and roses until the fat hits the fan. Until something really hard happens. Theological depth comes from years of study and from years of struggle with your own relationship with Christ. And in most cases, it has to be both. It has to be both. You know, I just finished Dietrich Bonhoeffer's little book, Life Together. He talks about the Christian life together. And yeah, we were laughing yesterday with a friend of ours. You know, Bonhoeffer he writes with the certainty that only a early 20th century German intellectual could write with. There's just sometimes you just go, is it really that certain what you're but in all seriousness, when you read Bonhoeffer, you read someone who has done both of those things, who has read and read and read, but also who has meditated on what he has read, and who has struggled with the personal and social implications of the gospel. That's theological depth. And it's really interesting. I mean, sometimes I look back at old sermons from 20 years or 25 years ago, and I think, man, I was really good at putting together outlines back then. But I know that I did not speak with the same insight into the human condition, the same insight into what God is doing in our lives. I simply had not had enough experience in life and enough time to process the experience that I had had. So theological insight. And then, of course, another thing that we ignore is proven character. Notice my word proven there. It's a word that Paul uses in Romans 5. He uses one Greek word that speaks to this idea of tested and proven character. And look, a lot of organizations give lip service to, hey, character first, right? But when you start to really talk to them, and especially the ones who have gotten themselves into dysfunction, the ones who've gotten themselves into trouble, what you find is, well, yeah, we valued character until it got in the way of success. We are Americans after all, And, the other problem with these three things that we ignore is that it's very hard to figure those out when you're looking at a candidate for leadership from a resume or a curriculum vitae, or even an interview for that matter, right? These are hard things to come up with. Of course, it's even harder when we don't look for them, but it's hard to come up with these things. So this is our leadership landscape as I see it. And even if I'm a little goofy and a little off in how I've evaluated where North American Christianity is, this portrait is still a good starting point for our reflections on what Paul is doing here in 1 Thessalonians. Preachers are always really confident in their own assessments of things, aren't they? But, we got to start somewhere. And we bring this sort of assessment of where we are to the text. And then we look at what's in the text. And we realize that as Paul is reminding the Thessalonians of what he and Silas and Timothy did, how they lived, how they ministered, we see Paul bringing to the surface 7 pieces of evidence, 7, you might even call them characteristics of the missionary's leadership. The first of these is that these missionaries demonstrated courage in the face of opposition. Now, courage in the face of opposition is not a foolproof evaluator, because there are some people who just have a persecution complex. But I suspect that most of us are able to tell the difference between those two. Why is courage in the face of opposition so important? It's an indicator of something deeper in someone, an indicator that their commitments run far beyond their own career aspirations. their own avocational aspirations, if you're talking about volunteer leaders. Right? We're going to come back to that point in a little bit, because it actually ties a lot of these things together. But Paul, Silas, and Timothy, they had just been run out of Philippi. They get to Thessalonica. They start proclaiming the word. And what happens? A riot breaks out. Now, I got to tell you, I don't know that I have that kind of courage. I think after what had happened in Philippi, I might be kind of going, Lord, could I lay low for a little while? That's not what Paul, Silas, and Timothy do. They move on to the next place. And even though a riot eventually breaks out, they proclaim the gospel faithfully. They do what God has called them to do. That's verse 2. Now look there at verse 3. There is an integrity in their message and their motives. Their motives line up with the message that they are preaching. And the message that they are preaching itself has an internal integrity. Notice what Paul says. We did not preach to you the gospel. Not just, he says, he mentions the impure motives. That's obvious, because people will use the gospel for their own purposes. Right? Even people who think they mean well. They will use the gospel for their own purposes. But notice the other thing that he says. We didn't preach the gospel to you out of error. Paul, Silas, and Timothy knew what they were preaching. They understood the message that God had given them. And they proclaimed that message with pure motives. Now, on a related point, I should say, look there at verses 4 and 5. Not only is their message and their motives lined up, not only do they have integrity in how their message is structured, but they use rhetoric responsibly. Now, Aristotle defined rhetoric as the art of persuasion. Everybody in the ancient world used it. Now, some of them used it well, some of them didn't. But everybody who wrote or who spoke publicly used rhetoric. It's just like, today we might use a PowerPoint presentation, or, we might do advertising, or whatever it is, whatever it is that we use to get our point across. Rhetoric was what they did to do that. Now, the thing is, though, just like advertising, rhetoric could be deceptive. Rhetoric could be self-serving. Rhetoric could be vacuous and empty and do more harm than it did good. The philosophers in the ancient world were aware of this fact. Some traveling preachers were described as sophists. People who simply get out there and pontificate for no reason other than to really just build themselves up, or for some other selfish end. That is not how these three missionaries worked. They used rhetoric responsibly. Another Pauline text will say, to build up the church. Remember, we did Ephesians earlier this year, and we talked about how for Paul, everything that we do, in fact, is to be about building up the church. Well, here Paul, Silas, and Timothy are living that example. Now, that's a lot to think about already, but Paul ain't through. Typical Paul. Paul never got the message that you're only supposed to have 3 points, right? So Paul keeps going. What does he say? Not only do they use rhetoric responsibly, but they exercise their spiritual authority with compassion and gentleness. Now I want you to look here at verse 7, and I want you to skip down to verse 10 and 11. Okay? Now, what is Paul doing here? If by the way, if your translation says, "We were gentle among you," that is certainly, I'm looking at verse 7 there. If your translation says, "We were gentle among you," that is an acceptable translation because there's a textual problem here. I won't get into all of it. It could simply be gentle. I actually favor the reading that the NIV is hinting at when it says young children. We were like young children among you. The word is actually infants. But I think some scholars have a little bit of trouble there because then Paul immediately changes and says, well, yeah, actually we were like nursing mothers among you. Well, okay, Paul, which is it? Well, you know Paul. It doesn't have to be a which is it for him. Paul loves to switch analogies. And in fact, if you jump down to verses 10 and 11, he switches analogies again and says, we were like fathers among you. What is he trying to say? He is trying with every resource that he has available to him to communicate the gentleness and compassion that surrounded their exercise of spiritual authority. Now, verse 6 says they have this spiritual authority, okay, because they are apostles. But that's not how they lived. That's not how they lived. I think I've told you all the story before of my encounter with James Leo Garrett, the legendary Baptist theologian, at the award dinner where the award given in his honor was awarded. And I've talked about how humble this man was. Here's a guy who has, 2 PhDs, including one from Harvard, a Master of Theology from Princeton Seminary. You're just like, if anybody has a right to be arrogant, it would be him. And generations of Baptists have used his systematic theology. And yet he just pretended just to be nothing. And to be like, he treated me, I was the award winner that year, like I was a colleague. I had no business being treated like a colleague. I was a New Testament guy. In fact, my advisor walked over and said, Wade, are you really going to be crass enough to accept an award in historical theology? I didn't even have, and it was Bruce Corley, and he has this big grin on his face, like he's got me. And Dr. Garrett said, now, Bruce, you know that someone can have more than one specialty. I wanted to crawl under the table. But that's not just humility. That's gentleness at work. That's the kind of compassion and gentleness and care that Paul and Silas and Timothy modeled for their congregations. And that kind of gentleness and care was so countercultural that it even got them in trouble sometimes. We see that in 2 Thessalonians, the second letter that Paul writes, where he says to them, we ought to have treated you this way. We ought to love God or love you in the way that we did. We ought to thank God for you. It's right for us to do that. In the Corinthian correspondence, Paul is forever having to chide the Corinthians for, look, We didn't abuse you like other spiritual authority figures in the ancient world abused their people. Oh, perish the thought. But Paul and Silas and Timothy did it anyway because they knew that it was right. And in fact, they went beyond that. Look there in verse 8. They gave of their very selves, their very lives to these people. I tried to come up with a conceptual way to kind of summarize what Paul's doing there in verse 8. I couldn't come up with one. Vulnerability is not enough. Transparency is not enough. Self-disclosure is not enough. They didn't just disclose their true selves to these people. They gave their true selves to them. Isn't that amazing? Here these people are. They had only known Paul and Silas and Timothy for a few weeks. And yet, these three missionaries are all in. Not just all in with the gospel, all in with the Thessalonian Christians. So much so that Paul will later say, man, we have wanted to come back and visit you, but we just haven't been able to yet. So that's why I had to write this letter. Now, as part of giving their whole lives to these people, look there in verse 9. Strenuous, inconvenient labor on behalf of the faith community. That's what these missionaries did. Now, Paul never heard of something called work-life balance. And I'm not saying that we should necessarily emulate his example in that regard. Most of us are not the Apostle Paul. He just seemed to have a limitless supply of energy. And yet at the same time, there will be a moment, a time, a season in our lives where we have to make real substantive sacrifices on behalf of whatever organization it is that we're leading, whether it be a church or denomination or parachurch organization. No, we don't want to be one of those people who is married to the church and, our wife and kids or husband and kids never see us. That's not who we want to be. But that's also why Paul in 1 Corinthians 7 says, if it was really up to me, I'd say don't get married so that you can work Paul's schedule. Leaders have to be willing to do the hard work, to be the one who burns the candle on both ends. I'll use an example from First Baptist Church of Arlington. I don't think anybody there will mind me pointing this fact out. Dennis Wiles, the lead pastor there, is a friend and mentor of ours. He insists that his staff go home. You can do that tomorrow. You need to go home. You have a family. You need to go home. But does he go home? No, not really. The first time that Natalia and I had a meeting with him, we got there at like 4:00. We didn't walk out till 6, and he didn't leave with us. He just, showed us to the door and went back to work. That's a good boss. That's a faithful leader. Someone who not only doesn't ask of you what he's not willing to do himself, but someone who asks more of himself than he asks of you. Paul, Silas, and Timothy did not have to work their way through. They were as apostles, entitled to the support of their congregation or of other congregations. They were entitled to that support, but they chose not to use that support. Why? Because they wanted to model for the community an ethic of hard work. It may also be because they wanted to accelerate the pace of their missionary activities, but certainly they wanted to model for the Thessalonians what it looks like to be a Christian leader, what it looks like to be a Christian in general. We work hard. That's what we do. We're faithful people, faithful to our jobs, faithful to our families. We work hard. They wanted to model that. And it was a good thing, because those of you who've read 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Paul later has to come back and say, all right, all you lazy loafers out there, get to work. And he can say that because he did it himself. Now, that's verse 9. Look at verse 10. Look at verse 10. Paul, Silas, and Timothy modeled holiness, righteousness, and blamelessness. Now, we could just stop here and give the invitation, because how many of us can make that same claim? But let's think about that for a moment. Okay? Now, Paul says this is the life we lived. We lived holy and righteous and blameless lives among you. But notice what he does right after that. Okay? So he's talking about the quality of their lives, but he's also talking about the orientation of their message. Notice the purpose of acting like a father among them, or in this case, 3 fathers. It was to comfort them, to encourage them, and to exhort them to live lives worthy of God. Once again, notice the correspondence between life and message. Now, typical Paul, we've looked at one of his texts, and it feels like a fire hose, right? He's given us a whole lot to chew on. Is there something that can tie all of this together? Is there something that can make all of this make sense? Look back up at verses 4 and 5. You might have missed it if you went through it too quickly. These missionaries had a North Star that shaped everything they did. They had a North Star that framed and guided every word, every action. What was it? It was pleasing God. They wanted to please God. That's why they had the courage to speak out, and why that courage wasn't from some sort of persecution complex, is because they were living their lives to please God. The reason that they didn't allow frustration to carry them away, or impure motives to contaminate their work, is because they were living their lives in such a way as to please God. I got to tell you something. Sometimes I get frustrated with people. When people do things that I just think are ridiculous, and when they will not listen to reason, I lose my temper a little bit. Natalia knows what I'm talking about. I lose my temper a little bit. But the truth is, am I really being motivated by pleasing God in that moment? Or am I being motivated by my own desire to be right and my own desire for them just to do what I tell them to? Paul, Silas, and Timothy gave of all of themselves because their life was about pleasing God. That's what God has done for us. So they reasoned, well, that's what we should do for our brothers and sisters. Right? Pleasing God ties into every one of those 7 things that I listed for you out of this text. Those 7 characteristics of Christian leadership. They all center on pleasing God. Now, in closing, there's been a lot of controversies about passages like 1 Timothy 3, 1 through 13, and Titus 1, 5 through 9. Easy for me to say, right? But a lot of times these controversies bury the lead. They lose the point. 1 Thessalonians 2 reminds us what that point really is. For those of us who are leaders, we need to ask ourselves some hard questions. Not just about what we do, but about why we do it. Are we in Christian leadership, whether ordained or lay, whether paid or volunteer? Are we in Christian leadership because we want to please God and because that is the burning passion of our hearts? Or are we in Christian leadership to meet some other, perhaps even partially unrecognized need? What is our real motivation? And look, if you look deep in your heart and you go, ooh, my motivations are more mixed than I thought they were, welcome to the club. I'm the club president. You can be club vice president, but I'm the club president. You know, conviction starts here. What was the old slogan at the end of every G.I. Joe cartoon when I was a kid? Knowing is half the battle. You can't work on it if you don't know it. Right? For churches, denominations, parachurch organizations, we've got some work to do. My view is that we need to significantly recalibrate how we select, train, and evaluate leaders. And don't ask me what that all looks like, because I don't know. Glenn may know. No. I don't know. And I've done a lot of reading, and I still, and I've got some ideas about certain things. I've got some ideas about things that I think are important. But I suspect that, like so many other things that we read in Scripture, this text and its implications are more far-reaching than I have imagined, than a lot of us have imagined. But the great thing is we don't have to do it by ourselves. And none of us can anyway. We get to do this together. And the more that we put this into practice in our own lives, the more creativity will be generated in terms of how we work through this. And there'll be some trial and error. You know, there always is in discipleship, right? I mean, none of us is a perfect disciple of Jesus. None of us gets it right the first time. But we get to do it together, and we get to do it in the shadow of God's amazing, inexhaustible grace.
Amen.
And that is a beautiful thing.
Amen.
Let us pray.